This week on a lively experiment, next month voters will decide whether to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on school construction, with a lot of questions still unanswered. And the race for the first congressional district seat heads into the home stretch. We'll tell you what a recent poll says about the race.
A lively experiment is generously underwritten by...
Hi, I'm John Hazenwhite Jr. For over 30 years, A Lively Experiment has provided insight and analysis of the political issues that face Rhode Islanders. I'm a proud supporter of this great program and Rhode Island PBS.
Joining us on the panel, Billy Hunt, chairman of the Libertarian Party of Rhode Island, Nancy Lavin, senior reporter for the Rhode Island Current, and political contributor Jim Vincent. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's Lively. I'm Jim Hummel. Rising interest rates and skyrocketing construction costs have not deterred half a dozen communities in Rhode Island from asking voters to approve bonds for renovations or new school construction. Their sell, an enhanced state reimbursement that expires next year. But is this the right time to be launching these projects? Billy, let me begin with you. You and I are both in communities where they're asking this. You've been paying pretty close attention to this issue.
Sure. I mean, obviously, this is something that is very important for the education in Rhode Island and something people want to be considerate about. The question I have is the logic behind having these type of elections during a non-election year. Where we have a special election, we're going to have a small percentage of the voting population come out and obligate these cities and towns to, what is it, something like $865 million of total school funding between, Middletown, North Kingston, Bristol, Warren, Barrington. And the question is this a situation like gambling where, we can easily get a bond passed when it's a general referendum for the entire state for gambling, but when it comes to a city like Newport, when it comes to actually having gambling in their city, they've actually rejected that proposal. So is this something where it's easy to get school funding bonds passed, in general, but when it comes to actually hitting the rubber to the road in the communities and the local communities that are actually going to be funding the majority of this, are they worried that they're not going to pass the bond, so they're trying to squeeze them into these special elections where special interest and a low voter turnout will be obligating the taxpayers is really my concern.
Well, I think, it's pretty well known that most of the schools in Rhode Island need repair or need to be replaced. So they need to have done yesterday. So I don't know if there's anything nefarious going on in terms of trying to schedule them in off-year elections. I think people are just doing them as fast as they can because the need is there. So I just think that perhaps the cities and towns should be more transparent in terms of exactly what people will be voting on. I think that there could be some work done there. But I think that, these projects should have been, they needed to be done yesterday because you've got some major problems. Look at Bristol with the flooding in the basement. So I think that education and the safety of our children is so important that I think you just got to do it whenever you can do it.
But if it was so important, why didn't they do it during the last November election? I mean, does anybody remember what the $400 million worth of bonding that was voted on back in 2021 when we had a special election? And all these school bonds that are being, floated out during these special election years. I mean, it doesn't seem to me that this is something that if it needs to be done yesterday, it's something that we should have been focused on. Well, why are we waiting for a special election when the expiration is coming up?
I think part of the problem. I think part of the problem is not the problem, but the issue is the enhancement from the state is going to be expiring next year. So I think a lot of schools are waking up and saying if we can get almost half of it reimbursed, right?
Yeah, I mean, and I think the other thing is perhaps it seems like, as you alluded to with interest rates rising, we've seen projects, not school projects. I've written a lot about the soccer stadium in Pawtucket and how costs have gone up because of rising interest rates and supply chain woes. I don't know, but it could be that people were kind of waiting to see if the economic conditions would be a little more favorable to borrow this year, and they're not. But now, it's kind of rubber meets the road, borrow or as you said, lose the incentive. I think to me, the thing that is sort of curious and what you wrote about in your story last week is when a city like Warwick approves bonding, but then costs go up, both because of rising supply costs and interest rates, and also things like bond underwriting costs that were not included in the original ballot question. So voters, however many there are voting on something that costs X amount in November, but may actually cost, 20% more by the time the bonds get issued.
Yeah, well, you got to be transparent. You got to make sure you get it right the first time. You can't have, voters later finding out that this wasn't in there, this wasn't in there. I don't know why people wait and they didn't do it in the past, but I do know that with those incentives expiring, it's incumbent upon any city or town that wants to deal with education and the buildings to get those projects going now.
The General Assembly has extended the deadline twice already, so the fact that they're going to sit here and say that that's the reason why we're pushing this through at the last minute is kind of just a red herring, in my opinion.
And what Nancy alluded to, I'd done a story for the Hummel Report that was in the Providence Journal about a week ago. In Warwick, because, look, if interest rates and rising construction costs are going up, you can't afford as much, then they start trimming stuff out of the project. And they call it, there's this great euphemism, great or not great, called value engineering. I mean, does not sound great? Hey, value engineering. It means the track might go, the lighting might go, the air conditioning. So from a philosophical point of view, and the guy that I talked to said, should you go back to voters if it changes significantly?
I think 100%. I mean, a lot of these, programs are sold by the add-ons and the things like the track and the field and the lighting and being able to do certain community events at the building. The other question is that where you have these large school buildings, we're basically setting ourselves up for the next 50 years of the same educational system that we have right now. There's no innovation. There's no, charter schools and, private schools have been doing a lot better in cities like Providence and stuff like that. So why aren't we looking for different models instead of going ahead and rebuilding the same exact failed education system for the next 50 years and condemning our students to basically that same model?
It's a good point because taxpayers statewide have already approved hundreds of millions of dollars in bond. And I wonder, too, in Providence, remember there was a big deal a couple of years ago about we've got all this money, when the Hopkins report came out, it was, we're gonna put money into all the schools. Is that happening? You don't hear a lot about that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably everything that people thought was going to happen in the wake of the Hopkins report has not really materialized to the degree that we thought it would in terms of both, funding, but also just obviously with the state test scores that have come out, school performance, what the state takeover has meant for Providence Public Schools. Whether that's a failure or not, I think depends upon who you ask, but I think we haven't really seen the concrete recommendations that the Hopkins report laid out really come to bear, and it's been
and there's
4
a little
years.
bit of a disconnect because while the state's running the education of Providence, the schools still belong to the city.
Right.
So there's kind of a tug, and there was a big issue a year ago with closing some elementary schools, that type of thing.
Well, going back to the original thing in terms of should the voters get to know, decide to vote again in terms of any increase in terms of the cost, who determines what that increase is, where that threshold is? How's that determined? Who makes that decision?
Right. Is it enough different that you would have to go back, and what's that dividing
What
line?
is that? What's that line? What's that threshold? And in terms of the Hopkins reports, I agree. There's a lot to be said about opportunities missed or have been missed up to this point. So hopefully, those opportunities will materialize over the next couple of years because, I know I'm disappointed in what I'm seeing.
You think any of those bonds are going to go down in any community?
No, 60% bonds pass in this state in general, so it's kind of a moot point. But again, we have no problem about spending and putting money on the credit card, but to the point that we needed to keep the school buildings maintained and everything like that. We don't have a plan like Peter Alviti does for the infrastructure plan about maintaining these schools going forward. And are we just throwing money at the problem and rebuilding schools for the fact that they're just going to deteriorate over the next few years anyway?
All right. The Act on Climate passed a couple of years ago, set out benchmarks for trying to get away from carbon footprint. And a lot of people have said, well, how are we going to measure this? What are the metrics? Nancy, you wrote about this week, that there's an interim report that's come out.
Yeah. So, I mean, the sort of top line news is, we're doing great. If you look at 2020, well, no one was driving, no one was flying, no one
was leaving their house.
Yeah, I mean, the first line of the story I wrote was nothing like a pandemic to slash carbon emissions. But kind of the kicker to that is that, we expect, or the DEM, which reports the inventory based on federal data, expects emissions will go back up for 2021, which will be out next year. And kind of the other I think interesting thing to me as I've covered this is that, Act on Climate sets these incremental benchmarks of where we need to go relative to the 1990 baseline. So the first benchmark was 2020, the next one's 2030. However, because there's this long lag in when the EPA is able to collect and then submit the data about where our emissions are coming from and how much they are each year, we're not actually going to know if we meet or don't meet the
It's a three-year disconnect?
Three-year lag. So, 2030, we're not going to know till 2033. And the other part of that gets interesting is at some point, I don't remember what the year is, people can start suing the state for failing to meet the benchmark. But it doesn't say, the benchmark is 2030 for 45% reduction as we find out in 2033. So it's unclear when the lawsuits are going to start and how the Attorney General is going to be able to defend those if we don't have the data. And I think DEM, I think from my reporting kind of feels a little hamstrung, like they're at the mercy of the federal government. A lot of other states are also asking the EPA to kind of like speed up the data collection process. But at this point, we don't really know what's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, the two biggest drivers of carbon emissions in the state is transportation and home heating, I believe. And, Jim, you did a great story about the state's failure to even comply by their own mandates, where less than 10% of the vehicles that they purchased are not plug-in hybrids or hybrid vehicles themselves. This is something that is a growing issue where I know dealerships are turning away EV inventory because they have over 100 days of inventory and they can't keep internal combustion engines on the lot because people aren't adopting. It takes a lot of extra money and resources and infrastructure for the charging infrastructure that's not in place. And I mean, this goes to the overall affordability issues that we have in our state, where housing is unaffordable. Now transportation is going to be made more unaffordable because electric vehicles are 15% more expensive than internal combustion engine vehicles. You have to out retrofit your house with the charging station. You have to worry about if you're trying to do long trips, about getting a different type of vehicle that can maintain that type of thing. And realistically, the mandates really put us in a bad position as a state in terms of if we're trying to address things like affordability and housing and everything like that. Because again, the next biggest expense besides your housing costs is usually your car payment. And if we're going ahead and making people or enticing people to do heat pumps and retrofitting their houses and electric panels and stuff like that, that's additional cost that's just going to add more to the bottom line.
I was going to say, I think the interesting thing about that too is that there are mandates for where Rhode Island has to reduce, how much Rhode Island has to reduce emissions. There are no mandates for what residents or businesses have to do. Right now, the state is taking this lead by example approach, which it's also sort of not ironically not meeting itself, but then sort of expecting that people will, through incentives or just kind of like modeling of good behavior, people will follow suit. And it's a big jump that we need to get to from 2020 to 2030 in terms of the carbon reduction.
And we're already at 23. And government, there's turnover. Who's keeping track of, is there one person keeping his or her eye on the ball?
Well, I guess one person is not keeping his or her eye on the ball because each department, for example, with the state, they do their own purchasing. So, I mean, in terms of this waiver thing, which is almost universally accepted, you got to have somebody that's in charge that can say, look, and unless you have a really good reason to have a waiver, then we need to do these kinds of things in terms of these light vehicles that's going to help reduce these emissions. And I think that, as far as the technology that's being developed, I think it's rapidly coming online. I know the governor's putting $25 million into technology to make sure that
charging stations.
So things are happening a little bit faster than they were even 3 or 4 years ago. So you have that. And I just think that, there's got to be a happy balance here. I know that electric vehicles are more expensive, but if you're going to reduce emissions over time, you have to create that balance. I don't think there's anything else you can do but do that.
The story Billy alluded to that I did in late September was that the government is supposed to be meeting a certain deadline, but what you were talking about is the purchasing. So if DEM or DOT or whoever wants a car, they have their own budget. So if it's going to cost a lot more for an EV, are they going to do that? And they've never denied a waiver. So there's really no teeth. No wonder there's only 10% rather than 25%.
Yeah, it's something that, again, I think the idea of electric vehicles is a feel-good idea that people say, oh, we'll mandate this stuff and, everybody will be driving electric vehicles. But when the actual rubber hits the road, no pun intended, the cost is just not feasible.
You sent me a detailed email, no surprise. Whenever I do a story, Billy gives me the whole rundown in a good way, stuff that I hadn't thought about. The weight of electric vehicles. And so talk about that a little bit. Parking decks.
Yep. So, well, that's just something that I thought about is our current infrastructure, especially being in the Northeast with older infrastructure, are the parking structures available to take the additional weight of these vehicles? I work in the insurance industry. One of the big issues is the third-party liability of these vehicles, because obviously a heavier vehicle is safer for the occupants, but if you hit a smaller car or a pedestrian or a bicyclist, you're going to create a lot more damage for those individuals. The other end of it is the physical damage coverage is much more expensive on these vehicles as well too, because the batteries are integrated in the frame of these vehicles. So if you get into a minor fender bender, a lot of times it damages the battery and you have to total the entire vehicle. And with the carbon emissions to create these vehicles is significantly more expensive than it is for an internal combustion engine vehicle. So if you inevitably total a car with less than 60,000 miles on it, you're going to have a negative negative impact compared to internal combustion engine that's easier to repair as well.
Just finally, where are we on this? What's the next benchmark?
So
We're
the
still
next
a ways
benchmark
off.
is 2030, which is we're supposed to reduce emissions below the 1990 baseline by 45%.
But interim reports in between? I mean, are we going to hear anything
So
in 20...
DEM is supposed to be coming out with its next sort of update, but and there'll be annual inventories, but there's no benchmarks in Act on Climate until 2030.
Well, and my memory was in the whole, the lead by example, the changing of the executive order that Governor McKee did that I reported on got lost in the headlines of, and these are going to be DEM regulations, no gasoline cars sold in 2035. And I think DEM still has to have those hearings, right? That's
right,
not
yeah.
quite
I think
there
it's
yet.
still it's a proposed rule at this point, so it's not considered a final rule yet.
Okay. We are very close to the CD1 race. There hasn't really been any polling up until this week. Gabe Amo, of course, against Gary Leonard in the special election to replace David Cicilline. It turns out that Salve Regina did a poll. It showed that Mr. Amo is ahead of Mr. Leonard, 46 to 35, but with 15% undecided. And that kind of jumped out at me. Like, people at this point wouldn't know who they were voting for.
Well, that jumped out at me too, but what also jumped out at me is that among independents, actually Mr. Leonard is leading Gabe Amo 26 to 25 with 40% being undecided. And we're
What are you reading into that?
Well, that means that the election is not going to be a 30 or 40 point blowout like some people might think it could have been. It's going to be close, and I think that the fact that 54% of the elected voters, or the registered voters, are either independent or Republican, 54%, the majority, anything can happen. So I think that, Mr. Amo probably will be winning, and he's a great candidate. I know him well, know his family. I just think that, we'll see this 2 television debates, and we'll take some poll, and we'll see what happens.
It's been kind of quiet.
Yeah, this race has been such a sleeper. Up to the primary was wild, and then it just fell asleep, comatose. And I think to me what was, as you said, so many people being undecided, I also sort of wonder, honestly, in answering a poll, does undecided really mean I don't care enough to vote? And I do think there's perhaps a level of apathy or even just unawareness. We're all tuned into it because of our jobs, but there's not, if you are just the average resident, you're not probably seeing or hearing much about the race in the news or on TV. Maybe these 2 televised debates next week will liven things up a little bit, create some more voter interest. But to me, what that really says is people are just not necessarily interested enough in this race to vote.
You had reported the Secretary of State's vote tracker. It really seems like not a lot of people are even doing the early voting.
Yeah, I mean, I think some people will always vote early, and those are the people who are most committed, is what political scientists say. The people who have their minds made up are super politically active. And I think in an off-year election, in general, we're not going to see high turnout. But the early voting is low, and I don't know that it's even going to turn out.
Spike on election day.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think the Leonard campaign is going to break 40%. I'd be surprised if they gather a third of the vote in this election, to be honest with you. There was a lot more enthusiasm around the Ashley Kalis campaign, and she fell flat on her face, to be honest with you. So I really think that special elections provide an opportunity for an upset of the establishment candidate. I just haven't seen the get out the vote in the ground game from the Leonard campaign. I mean, obviously you're going to have the Republicans that are going to vote for the Republicans and the Democrats that are going to vote for the Democrats. But, as an unaffiliated voter, my wife, I have friends and family that are unaffiliated voters. We're not being reached out to by the campaign to, again, to sway the undecided.
You'd be the ones.
Yeah, and I mean, to be honest with you, the Democrats chose the moderate candidate in Gabe Amo. So if you sit there and look at the independents, and especially with what's going on in Congress and the Speaker's race, Speaker of the House race and everything like that, they very well could just say he's a moderate Democrat and just decide to go vote for Gabe. And
you think it would be a different dynamic if it was Aaron Regenberg or somebody who was a little bit more
I think it would be a completely different race. And, anecdotally, it's very interesting to see that a lot of, Terry Flynn signs and even Alan Waters signs have been replaced by Jerry Leonard signs. But I have not noticed any marketable increase in Gabe Amo signs. The Regenberg signs have come down, the Kano signs have come down, the Matos signs have come down, and they haven't been replaced by anything. So I wonder if there's a little bit of apathy in the Democratic Party, but I still think in the end they come out and vote and support the candidate.
I've been thinking about this week. You think about 2016, the election. Hillary Clinton, a lot of people, both candidates had their issues, Trump and Clinton. Hillary Clinton, a lot of people just sat out that race, and 8 million fewer people voted in that election, Democrats, than did for Obama in 2012. And I wonder, I don't think it's going to repeat itself with a Leonard victory, but you wonder whether it's a complacency that a lot of the Democrats just think, Amo's got it, why do I need to go? And you wonder whether that's going to narrow. I don't know if he's going to break the 40%, whether you're going to narrow it. Because people like Gabe Amo, I don't need to go to the polls, it's a special election, right?
Well, I think that could happen. That's why the Gabe Amo campaign needs to be diligent, because anything can happen in a special election, especially an off-year election like this. It seems to be playing out into. So I think that he has to work all the way through the end of the line, through the tape. I've talked to him. He said he's definitely going to do that. And, like I said, 40% of the independents are undecided, and he's leading, or Leonard is leading him among independents 26 to 25. So that number might not be credible, but, you got to look at that.
I think what works in his favor is to get out the vote. And clearly he did that for the primary. And this is Mr. Leonard's first race, but Amo's been through this now. And then he's got the whole Democratic machine behind him.
Right. He's also got the funding. The latest pre-primary campaign finance reports came out yesterday, and he has, so much more funding and cash on hand than Gary Leonard does. But I do think, from my perspective as a journalist, it's not just Gary who's kind of dropping the ball on the campaigning post-primary. Like Gabe Amo pre-primary, every single day we got a thing in our inbox, Gabe on the road, here's where he's going to be, here's what he's going to do. And then he won the primary, and it was like those emails stopped. Everyone was like, what's he doing? Where is he? Trying to get a hold of him for an interview was difficult. It still is. And, he's become a little bit more. There was some criticism of him for that. And I think now he started, posting on Twitter some photos of him making the rounds. But he's not he's turning down debates, deciding to only do 2, which is his prerogative. But his campaign is not running at the same sort of public steam and momentum that it was pre-primary.
I believe totally that's consultants driving that. Mm-hmm. I think it's all consultants saying you've got a comfortable lead, just don't step in it before the race. Final thought, do you think he should have done more than 2 debates?
No, I think he should have looked at this as something that was going to be a close race, respect the candidate, Jerry or Gary, I'm not sure.
Gary.
Oh, Gary. Not sure what his name
is. Which people don't even know because he's not out there.
They know now because of the ad. But anyway.
Gary, Larry, Terry.
Gary, Larry, whatever his name is. Yeah. But I think that to just assume you're going to walk right in there because you're a Democrat, I think it would have been erroneous. I think you got to make sure that you don't open yourself up to giving the opponent exposure that you didn't have to do, and then finding out that you lost a close election. He's not running to be the head of democracy debate, whatever award you get to be that person. He's trying to win an election.
How many should he have done?
Again, I don't think the debates are going to make any amount of difference in this race. I mean, obviously, you want the candidates to interview for the job, and but I don't think that enough people are tuned into this election at all to even care about the debates or even watch the debates. And unless some crazy thing happens, which usually doesn't happen in debates, I don't think they're going to make any difference if they did 2, 10, or none. To be honest with you.
All right, time marches on. Let's do outrages and/or kudos, Mr. Vincent. Let's begin with you this week.
Okay, my kudo is Casdi Cavallo, who has made the list.
Longtime attorney in Rhode
Longtime
Island.
attorney with Lopes, Pinone, Devereaux, and O'Gara. Very smart guy, very well known, very well respected. He's made the list for the most recent vacancy in district court, which was vacated by Mr. Smith, Chris Smith, who now is on the Superior Court. So I think that this is a golden opportunity to have somebody that is excellent to be on that court. Let's keep in mind, of the 87 judges in Rhode Island, only 7 are black or brown. Only 7. That's 8% in a state where 25% are black and brown. So we have a chance to move up from that 8% to maybe 10%. And I'm not a math major or a bean counter, but if we were to get 25% of the 87, that'd be 21 or 22 judges. That'll take another 100 years at the pace that we're going. So we need to be intentional and deliberate. We need to have Casdi Cavallo fill that vacancy.
You called it right here on the Supreme Court, right?
That's right. Melissa Long. I called it, and I think Casdi Cavallo will be the next.
You called it after you called Governor McKee about 100 times, right?
Well, not quite 100. So I think Kaz will be an excellent judge, and I think he needs to be on that district court, and I think we all will be better off.
Billy, what do you have?
My outrage is about the proliferation of nonprofit electioneering in all the campaigns recently, especially in the special election. We talked about not being contacted by the Leonard campaign. I've been contacted by numerous special interests that are supporting the bond referendums that are happening right now, and it really seems like it's violating the spirit of the nonprofit election requirement laws and everything. We're not talking about 501c5 organizations. We're talking about 501c3 organizations that are blatantly participating in political hot-button issues. Not only are they tax exempt themselves, but their donors can get tax exempts for any donations they make to the nonprofits themselves. And there's this weird shell game of corporations taking money from nonprofits to do independent expenditures. Coalitions get formed between nonprofits and corporations, and taxpayers are actually sending money to a lot of these nonprofits as well through the state budget. And it really doesn't seem right that the shadow government is basically this nonprofit juggernaut that is having a lot of say in the state government, and it seems like it needs to be something that needs to be addressed.
And you wonder who's paying attention to that and enforcing it, because 501c3, strict nonprofit, 501c4, you can do a little bit of lobbying, but who is enforcing that, right?
I've had some questions and back and forth with the Board of Election. There's very narrow time frames, something like 90 days that you're only allowed to have in order to actually make a complaint against some of these things. So it's really a flawed system, and it needs to be addressed.
All right, let's go to Nancy. Nancy, first of all, I didn't welcome you. Welcome for your debut of Lively. Nice to have you. You can read all of Nancy's stuff on the Rhode Island Current, which has been doing some great work. You get the last minute.
Yeah, so it's a kudos over an outrage.
Eli, do a twofer. I like that.
Love it. So Eli Sherman at PRI, love his work as always. He had a really good story this week about the Woonsocket mayor sort of unilaterally purchasing for $1 million a property in Woonsocket that she intends to use to build affordable housing on that's valued at $200,000. And sort of the kicker to this is that the city council didn't know about it. It may be a charter violation because typically purchases over $100,000 would have to get city council approval. She's saying it doesn't have to because it's using HUD funds. Kind of is this whole back and forth, and obviously there is a story of back and forth and charter violations and tensions between the council and the mayor in Woonsocket. I think to me the other sort of component of kudos is I've covered a little bit of Woonsocket politics, and it is tough not to crack. They don't like reporters very much there. Yeah. So
okay, that is all the time we have. Billy and Nancy, nice to see you, and Jim. Folks, come back here. We're heading into the home stretch to CD1, our last show before the election next week, so be sure and join us for that. Hope you have a great weekend, and join us back here next week as the Lively Experiment continues.
A Lively Experiment is generously underwritten by.
Hi, I'm John Hazen-White Jr. For over 30 years, A Lively Experiment has provided insight and analysis of the political issues that face Rhode Islanders. I'm a proud supporter of this great program and Rhode Island PBS.